This is the new Weight Watchers. It works for members like Jojo, who's learning simple, healthy habits, Sharia, who's making progress with meds, and Kim, who still gets to eat what she loves. For over 60 years, we've helped millions of members find what works for them. Now, it's your turn. Watch your life open up. Watch your story shift. Watch what you're capable of. Watch it work. Get started today at WeightWatchers.com.
This is episode 364 of That Shakespeare Life. Just like the work of William Shakespeare, That Shakespeare Life is supported by our patrons. Listeners like you can support the work we do here and access special insider extras at patreon.com/thatshakespearelife. Check it out today and stay tuned after the episode for even more details.
Hi, I'm Lauren Shook, Assistant Professor of English at Texas Lutheran University and author of A Place at Shakespeare's Table. Another great method for studying the life of William Shakespeare includes listening to this. It's That Shakespeare Life with my friend Cassidy Cash.
So they would gravel major roads like, say, Cheapside or Broad Street would be graveled. Most of the roads of London are just mud, and it's famous, for example, that the Strand, which is your great throughway between the west and the main part of the city, is mud right through the 16th century.
Welcome to That Shakespeare Life with Cassidy Cash. Cassidy believes that if you desire to successfully learn or perform Shakespeare's plays, then understanding the real life and history of William Shakespeare himself is a must. That Shakespeare Life is the podcast that helps you go beyond the curtain of some of Shakespeare's most iconic works and explore the world of early modern England as Shakespeare would have lived it, learning from the writers, historians, and performers who know it best. And now, here's Cassidy.
In Shakespeare's plays, he talks about, quote, travel, or uses the word traveler just under 80 times, which is just an extraordinary amount of movement. It includes references that suggest people traveled by foot as well as by horse, and the Queen Mab speech by Mercutio in Romeo and Juliet talks about a wagon that was used for transportation. There are other references that indicate there were items which would add comfort to someone's travel, and one reference from Comedy of Errors talks about being, quote, stiff and weary, end quote, from long travel. We also know that in a personal connection to William Shakespeare the man, playing companies often traveled around England visiting various inns and establishments of their patrons who hired out a production. This applied to the Lord Chamberlain's men as well, and with all of this travel, it begs the question of exactly what getting around England, particularly in a large group like a playing company, might have involved. What kind of vehicles would have been traversing the cities or countryside for Shakespeare's England? Were there paved roads, dirt paths, or maybe cobblestone streets? What about rules of traveling, such as stop signs, roundabouts, or other kinds of travel infrastructure? Whose job was it to decide where a road would be put? And then who carried the responsibility of maintaining those paths? Could you get a traffic ticket in Elizabethan England? Here today to help us answer these questions, including sharing with us what kind of vehicles traveled along England's roadways in Shakespeare's lifetime, details about what the roads were like, and the rules for traveling them, is our guest, Robert Bucholz. Robert Bucholz is professor of history at Loyola University, a fellow of the Royal Historical Society, and author of the book London, A Social and Cultural History from 1550 to 1750. You can find out more about Robert, along with links to his latest book, in the show notes for today's episode. Hello, Bob. Welcome to That Shakespeare Life.
Hi, Cassidy. How are you?
I am wonderful, and I'm excited to dive into this topic here today. And I'm wondering about the roads. Were there paved roads in Shakespeare's England? And if they were, what were they paved with? Because I'm pretty sure this is before the advent of asphalt.
That's right. Well, I'm really glad that you used the word dive, because that is exactly what we might do as we're walking the streets of London. So by our standards, the streets of London the streets of London are not really paved. They talk about pavement. What they meant by pavement was gravel. So they would gravel major roads like, say, Cheapside or Broad Street would be graveled. Most of the roads of London are just mud, and it's famous, for example, that the Strand, which is your great throughway between the west and the main part of the city, is mud right through the 16th century. So you have to watch your footing. After the Fire of London in 1666, There was a movement to gravel more thoroughly. And in the 18th century, you start to get wooden planks and eventually cobblestones. That actually kicks in right after the fire, cobblestones, and then finally, basically slabs of stone by the end of the 18th century.
Well, what about the rules for traveling along these roads? I mean, could you get a traffic ticket if you broke a transportation law?
Well, theoretically, you could, probably not for speeding. And it's famous that carters and people who drove carriages and coaches were speeding all the time, and they're accused of having spent the rest of their time in the pub. So it's not very safe. But there's no traffic cops. There's nobody's going to pull you over. Remember that law enforcement in London is the local constable, and each constable has a very small area based in the parish. And the constable is your neighbor, and probably a retired neighbor, probably an elderly neighbor. So he's not going to be flagging down coaches. Now, you could violate certain city ordinances. For example, you're not supposed to have iron shod wheels. You're supposed to have wooden wheels because the iron shod wheels mess up the gravel. They make the roads worse. So you could get a fine that was probably judged by somebody in the parish, a parish officer, and then it would go up the line and down the line. For the most part, people were able to evade these. As far as the rules of the road, it's not clear that in Shakespeare time there were very clear rules of the road, but they gradually emerged during the early modern period. And it's funny, it's interesting. When you're driving, you're supposed to keep to the left, but when you're walking, you're supposed to keep to the right. Now, if I may, I have a poem by Henry Erskine, who's writing towards the end of the 18th century. So this is out of our period. It's funny. Quote, "The rule of the road is paradox quite in riding or driving along. If you keep to your left, you are sure to be right. If you keep to your right, you'll be wrong. But in walking, a different custom applies, and just the reverse is the rule. If you keep to the right, you'll be right, safe and wise. If you keep to the left, you're a fool."
Well done. Well, now we'll remember that forever. It's perfect.
I certainly hope you do.
When I think of getting from place to place in Elizabethan England, obviously horseback riding immediately comes to mind as far as what I would expect. But now you're mentioning things like carriages and even laws about the kind of wheels they're supposed to use. So tell us about the vehicles of Shakespeare's lifetime. What kind of vehicles would have been available to get around?
So there have always been, or at least since the Middle Ages, there have been carts, and these would very often be one axle, right? And they would be pulled, interestingly, by horses. I didn't find a lot of reference to mules or donkeys. Mostly it's horses. And for really heavy loads, they might be pulled by 2, 4, 6 horses. So imagine how this is cluttering up the road, right? You have the carts, and they're just like the delivery. They're like the Amazon delivery truck or the UPS delivery truck, right? They're taking things through London. In addition, you have carriages. Now, people want there to have been carriages through the medieval and Tudor period. So if you see sort of not very good Tudor history, you'll see Henry VIII arriving in a carriage. And that didn't happen. Carriages get introduced to London about 1580. They don't become really, it's one of those technologies that really takes off very quickly, the way cell phones did with us. So by 1600, you have issues. So there's a famous poet named John Taylor, who was a Thames waterman, and he regarded the carriages as being a great competitor of his business. And he writes, "When Queen Elizabeth came to the crown, a coach in England then was scarcely known. Then 'twas as rare to see one as to spy a tradesman that had never told a lie." So carriages were rare. But by about 1610, people are complaining that carriages are clogging up the ways. Now, by carriage, I think I probably mean 2 different kinds of contrivance, or 2 different ways you can have a carriage. If you were rich, it was always the case that the poor walked and the rich rode. And once they could get off their horses and be transported in carriages, this was much better for the clothing. This was a sign of status. By the early 18th century, to have a coach and 6 or a coach and 8 meant that you had made it. Just as we measure people today by what they drive, so people were measured then by if they drove.
In our episode on winter and ice skating, we shared a painting from the 16th century, and there's a couple, they're seen riding in a horse-drawn sled. Now, they're going across a frozen river, which, of course, that episode was about frozen rivers, but it made me wonder whether or not that kind of horse-drawn transportation adapted maybe for hard ground instead of over a frozen river would have been used in the 16th and 17th century? Would people have been getting around in something comparable to a horse-drawn sled?
They certainly had sleds. And you hear about these in the country, but I have not run into a lot of references to trying to sled in London except on the river. As you probably know, the 17th century, the later part of Shakespeare's life, Europe is going through part of a kind of mini ice age. And so the Thames would freeze over. This became much less common in the 18th and 19th centuries as industrialization kind of heated up the river. And you see people drive sleds on the river. You see people with carriages, with wheels driving on the river. And by the 18th century, by the late 17th century, these wheels are, shod with iron. So they took those risks. It's amazing. And I know of far more people who drowned in the Thames when it was liquid than when it fell through when it was solid.
Which does speak to the significance of when we're saying, it froze over. It was pretty intense. And now what about transporting large amounts of goods? I mean, you mentioned a similarity between the carriages and the Amazon delivery drivers, but I'm thinking about the Lord Chamberlain's men. And when they're going on tour, which of course we have records of them traveling around and performing at a wide variety of different places across the countryside, but they would have had to have packed up not only their players, which was a goodly group of folks, but they had paraphernalia and costumes and props and all kinds of things that probably would have had to have gone with them. What did transporting all of that look like? Would they have had a caravan of carriages, or what would that transportation have been?
I think so. Again, I'm not familiar with a lot of documentation about this, but it had to be carts. So, for example, I work on the royal household, and there's a whole set of officers, and I mean 8, 10 at a time, called the cart takers, yeoman cart takers and groom cart takers. And I assume these are people who drive the carts. They're also, an important part of the job is arranging the carts. So the Lord Chamberlain's men probably don't have 12 carts laying around for just this contingency. They've got a contract. They've got to talk to a middleman about this. It could be that they borrowed the court's carts. Remember that Queen Elizabeth is always on progress all during the summer. So she too is out in the countryside with her carts, and they're bringing every necessity. She rarely wears a gown twice, right? Which of course meant that it was probably unlikely that our players could use the carts at the same time. So there's a high demand for carts in London. I do know that a cart in London will cost you pennies or a shilling the day before the Great Fire, and then it goes up to something like £2 or £3.
That's exceptional.
They're trying to save their goods.
I'm assuming the patron that's, the Lord Chamberlain himself probably would have been providing their ability to
Yes.
take this transportation. If they're going under his seal of approval, he's probably ensuring that they're able. And so that would make them some of the people who rented carriages, like you alluded
That's
to
right.
before,
That's right.
of getting
And
this around.
He has a staff. He has a secretariat. So in my work in the royal household, I love the administrative assistants, because you see in their correspondence that they get all the crazy things. The king was just given a lion. He'd like to see it. Could you deliver it to Kensington Palace tomorrow morning at 11?
I think there are so many administrative assistants right now identifying way too much with this part of the job.
It's impossible, right? The boss has impossible. So, okay, we've got to transport the Lord Chamberlain's man, out to Coventry tonight.
Yeah. Could you figure that out for us, please?
Could you figure that out? I don't know how many carts, because the Lord Chamberlain, of course, doesn't think about carts.
Yeah,
right?
No, he wasn't handling himself. He was like, no, here, go, make this happen.
He has people for that.
So all these methods are for getting around on dry land, or frozen rivers. But public transportation was also available on the waterways when the Thames was a liquid river. And one method that they used was known as a water taxi. Robert, tell us about this option for transportation. And was it known by the word taxi in Shakespeare's lifetime, or is that a term that we applied later?
I think it's an anachronistic term. So I've spent my time with the Oxford English Dictionary, the great authority. And the word taxi doesn't come into the language as having to do with transportation until 1907. And it refers to a taxonometer. I will mispronounce this, but it's basically how you calculate the fare, right? It's a machine to calculate the fare. The word cab appears around transportation in 1822. The word hackney goes back to the Middle Ages, but a hackney was a horse that you could rent. Hackney coach which certainly existed by about 1600, but the term linking the two together doesn't come in until 1664. Nevertheless, you could always rent a barge, and after 1600, you could rent a coach in the city of London. Barge traffic is how it's actually far more common to get from, say, the Tower of London to Whitehall, take a barge. First, it's cheaper. It's 3 to 6 pence. Whereas if you're going to hire a carriage has upper class connotations, that's going to cost you a shilling, 12 pence, 18 pence. It's more expensive. Secondly, it's probably a lot faster because you're not dealing with the traffic jams of London. The streets of London were very, very narrow. Noah Phelps, my graduate student who wrote a wonderful dissertation on this, has estimated the average width of a London street is 12 feet. So you're constantly caught on land in traffic jams of carts and horses and carriages and pedestrians. You're vying with 200,000 people within a square mile, maybe 2 square miles if you include Westminster. The river is also jammed with vessels because London is the greatest port. Well, by the end of the 17th century, probably the greatest port in Europe. It would vie with Antwerp.
If you're saying that the streets were an average of 12 feet across, I want to put that in perspective for the listener here. That's the average size of a horse stall, or, my husband is 6'2", so like that would be 2 of him. So it's incredibly crowded to be able to get an entire city moving down a street of that size. Yes.
And as a pedestrian, you're vying with all these vehicles because there are no sidewalks. Sidewalks get mandated in the Rebuilding Act of 1666-67. And after that, there's a kind of sidewalk. But other than that, you are navigating the streets and the sloughs. And let us not forget that the street is also the sewer, right? There are no underground sewers.
So pleasant. Ugh.
So you've got to watch that bit in the middle. Well, look, it would stink anyway because of all the animals. Your principal method of moving people around is animals who do not. London animals, I'm going to assume, do not have any more of a sense of propriety than any other kind of animals. So everything is in the street.
Nothing like studying Elizabethan streets to make you appreciate our sanitation infrastructure.
Absolutely. Students will write sometimes in course evaluations, "Oh, Professor Bucholz, he loves the period he studies." True. And he wishes he could live there. False.
Hold the boat. Yeah.
Hold the boat. No, I'm happy here. Want to stay in this century. So to get back to the river, this is in some ways a much more serene form of transportation, but you are navigating your way between wherries and big ships that are unloading goods. And of course, there are hazards. You can get seasick. The Thames is a tidal river. It goes up, it goes down. It's hard to get a boat because the Thames is a tidal river and it goes up, it goes down. You may have to wade into the mud if we're at low tide. London Bridge is a great dam. And to shoot the rapids at London Bridge is so dangerous that it was thought in the later period that when somebody did that, they were trying to end their life. And finally, there were river pirates. You got to watch out for those.
Didn't know about river pirates?
Yeah, there were river pirates because remember, there's all these ships in the Thames. There aren't enough docks to handle the ships. So when you think of a ship, when you think of the Queen Mary moored next to the dock or your cruise ship, that's not how it worked. There were barges going back and forth, traversing the river. So you're trying to avoid them that are unloading the ships. Well, so there's a lot of moments when goods can be hijacked, can be misdirected. Sometimes the smuggling is done by the merchants themselves who want to avoid customs duties, who wouldn't want to avoid, paying the tax. But also sometimes river pirates will simply rob rich people in a barge. It's a confined space. You could board and you could take away their watches and their money. So the Queen has her own watermen, of course, and her own barges with the royal crest. One would be overly audacious to attempt that one. And of course, she will be accompanied by yeomen of the guard. She will be accompanied by people. But the rest of us, by the way, one thing I've neglected to mention is how easy it is to hail one of these barges. There's an estimate that there are thousands of barges plying the Thames, looking for fares. What happens is on shore, you'll see a waterman, a sturdy waterman, carrying his oar. And the as you know, in the Elizabethan age, in some ways, for many people, a pre-literate age, the way you knew that somebody did something is they wore the appropriate clothing or they carried the appropriate equipment. So you're carrying your oar, and this thing is big, and it's sticking up in the air. And so you know that that's a Thames bargeman. He's also shouting oars, oars, which, depending upon the English dialect you speak, may sound like an insult if you happen to be a young woman. But in fact, it simply means this is a method of transportation. London's river, the Thames, was lined with water gates. And the term Watergate originally meant that you could go down a street like Buckingham Street, and there at the end of it would be a water gate through whose portals you would reach steps down to the river, and there would be a barge. There's only one of these left at the end of Buckingham Street. Some people think it was designed by Inigo Jones, and it's a beautiful thing. And it's this beautiful gate that's now standing sort of in the middle of nowhere. It's in the middle of a field because they built the embankment. So it no longer opens out onto the Thames. But this is how you contracted for that kind of transportation. And you got in the barge, and assuming the river pirates left you alone, you would arrive at your destination much more quickly.
So if there were water taxis, were there also land taxis? Could Shakespeare have called a cab in Elizabethan London?
Yes, he could.
Just when you thought Shakespeare couldn't get cooler, you can see him standing on the streets of London hailing a cab.
Well, exactly. He'd have to hail because the city prohibited cab stands. They didn't want, for example, the Royal Exchange would be an obvious place for carriages to gather for this business. And so the city prohibited it. Now, whether that had teeth, I can't tell you. The city is also trying to limit the number of carriages in London. They want to limit it to 300. Forget it. It's impossible. So yes, the carriage men would drive up and down, or sometimes they would park and hope not to be rousted. And you could hail a cab and it would take you, hopefully, to where you wanted to go. You probably spent a lot of time just sitting in the cab fighting traffic. If you've ever hailed a cab in central London, right, in the middle of the day, you know what this is like.
Would they have called them cabs? When we're looking through the primary documents, what verbiage do we look for to say, oh, okay,
hire a carriage? To the best of my knowledge, cab doesn't come into the language in terms of transportation until the 19th century. So I was very disappointed to find that, by the way. I was kind of hoping. I
was too. I was hoping for that. But what would they have yelled?
That's a hey, you sir. I assume the universal gesture would have
holding
been
your
hand up would have been used. But the phrase hail a carriage is part of the language. But what word they would use to hail, I don't know.
Not sure what he would have hollered, but we know that Shakespeare could have hailed a cab. And I just love knowing that.
Why didn't he include it in a play?
You'd think that would fit, right? I don't know. One of the things that, we'll ask him when we all get to heaven one day. Now, one of the things we reference pretty frequently around here is that Shakespeare traveled to and from London and Stratford-upon-Avon on the regular. I even created an illustrated map diagramming places that I researched he could have stopped on one proposed route between the two places. I'll link to that map in the show notes. But the question I have about this traveling, Bob, is which mode of transportation Shakespeare would have not only had access to, but what do we know about what would have been most likely for him? Was he walking? Would he have taken a horse? How would he have gotten back and forth on a regular basis?
The first time he might have walked to London as a relatively modestly endowed young man. But once he became moderately prosperous, if he didn't own a horse, he could rent a horse. He would use a horse. Later, by 1700, there are regular coach services out to the West Country and to the North. You pick those up at London inns. And of course, a London inn, a classic London inn, was designed to accommodate horses. So the ground floor is all stabling and it's a courtyard. Very useful for traveling groups of players, of course, to put on a play in that courtyard. That's this kind of a dual significance. If you go to London and you take in a play at Shakespeare's Globe Theatre, do make sure you have a pint at the George Inn, which is the last sort of carriage inn from early modern England, and it's very close to the Globe. So he might have been able to take advantage of one of the very earliest carriage lines, but I doubt that he would. I think he'd probably ride.
Now, you've mentioned that the horseback riding, and you said he could have rented a horse, but I wonder if it was common for people to own their own horse, or would most people have participated in this horse rental situation? And please also tell us about hitching posts that might have been available from place to place. I mean, you mentioned that inns would have been set up to accommodate horses and travelers in that way, but were there stations along the road, or even, private homes that might have put hitching posts out front?
That's a really good question because, of course, the street, every inch of the street is of such high value. Why would you take up any of it to set up a hitching post? And yet this would seem to be of necessity. So perhaps, I'm just theorizing here, you would leave your horse at the nearest inn to where you wanted to go so that the inns operate the way parking structures do in cities today, right? You can't park in front of the bank in downtown Chicago that you want to do business with. You find the local parking garage. And so that's my theory. I do know that once sidewalks came in, there were hitching posts and there were bollards to separate the wheeled traffic and the horse-drawn traffic from pedestrians moving along the pavement. But early on during Shakespeare's time, I'm guessing you would use inns or any sort of public place that had a courtyard.
Well, I know we are thrilled to explore the entire world of carriages and taxis and water taxis and all the transportation that existed for Shakespeare's lifetime. And if we're new to this part of history, what are some reliable places you can point us towards that we should begin with if we want to learn more?
Well, there's different ways to do it. One way is to look at a map of London. And in some ways, the most useful of these volumes is something called the A to Z of Elizabethan London, which is basically takes the August map and breaks it up. It is contemporary to Shakespeare, and it is very, very detailed. And you can see the routes, and you can see how people got along, and you can see the various widths of streets. I mentioned someone who worked with me for his PhD. I'm reluctant to call him my student because he knows more about London transportation than I do, named Noah Phelps. If you have access to unpublished dissertations, Noah is well worth reading and very readable. I have been encouraging him to publish it, and if that is ever published, that'll be the best source. A wonderful historian of London streets is an 18th century historian by the name of Tim Hitchcock, who has awareness that moves across the centuries, who has written about begging London streets. He's written about London streets themselves and street life. If you want a general overview, I would be so immodest as to suggest my own book with Joseph Ward, London, A Social and Cultural History, 1550-1750, which includes 2 walking tours of London, one at the beginning of the period, one at the end of the period. But the main thrust of the book is trying to explain how a sleepy port town of a second-rate power eventually rose by the 18th century to become the most powerful and wealthy city in the world. So those would be my suggestions for a general history of London, the greatest history of London, done by the son of a London cab driver who had the knowledge and took his son with him. His name is Stephen Inwood. A History of London is a great brick of a book, but the answers are all there. And it is written by someone with complete, absolute, minute understanding of every square inch of London, a historian whom I admire greatly.
These are fascinating. We will list all of these in the show notes for today's episode, so make sure you check out there to see those. Now, Bob, we ask everyone this next question here at That Shakespeare Life, and that's, what's the one book you would take with you on a deserted island? My friends in England tell me I'm supposed to allow you the complete works of Shakespeare and a copy of the Bible, so your choice would be in addition to those. All
right. So my favorite book is the one I'm reading right now. In other words, so whatever that happens to be. Right now, I'm reading Orlando Furioso by Ariosto, and it's great. I would be tempted by something really long and meaty that I could sink my teeth in for decades, assuming that the rescue ship isn't coming. So I'm thinking of Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. But in fact, if I had to pick or recommend one single book to hold close to my heart for the rest of my life, a book which contains, I think, everything you need to know as a human being, I would choose Charles Dickens' A Christmas Carol.
Oh, my brother loves that book. It's his absolute favorite, and he would agree with you. So yes, I have had the virtues of A Christmas Carol been extolled extensively, and I can't help but agree with you that would be...
Mankind is my business. And if I could take a DVD player, the 1951 Alastair Sim British version.
How did you know I was
Scrooge.
going to ask? Which one was your favorite?
There is no competition. There is his command of both Scrooges, right? Because very often it's hard to believe when Scrooge turns nice. And this guy, it's a wonderful piece of humanity, I think. His and everyone else's, the supporting cast as well. It's a wonderful version. There are things in that movie that have made it into the sort of Christmas Carol way we think of things that they made up for the movie, but they're so in keeping with Dickens. For example, the whole backstory of his sister, that they've now become part of the story. So, wonderful film.
That's wonderful.
Wonderful book.
So, a book and a movie. So that's perfect.
Yeah.
What's next for you? What are you working on now that you're excited about?
Well, I'm working on the sort of, it's the book of my life. It's the book to summarize my life's work. So though I've written on London and I've written a textbook on English history, my research work, the work where I try to do original research is on the British royal household. One way of thinking about that is I try to approach the British royal household as a social historian would approach the village. So I'm as interested in the chambermaid and the groom of the stables as I am in the Lord Chamberlain and the Lord Steward. We talked about the administrative staff, and I want to know about them. So that's my approach. But also this is a book about soft power, the power of people behind the scenes, the power of the people who get to talk to the king. And what they say is never written down, but this may, in fact, be decisive. And so if I live to complete the book, at the heart of the book is a collective biography of 12,500 royal servants, and I'm taking no samples. I'm trying to find out about every single one of them. So it really is a case of whether I will outlast my material or my material will outlast me. But that is the book I'm working on. It is called The Theatre of Power, A Political, Social, and Cultural History of the British Royal Household, 1660 to 1783. And let us hope that one day it will appear.
That sounds wonderful. We'll look forward to seeing that come to fruition. Bob Bucholz, thank you so much for being here and talking with us about the history of transportation for Shakespeare's lifetime and helping us understand this part of his lifetime that much better. I really appreciate you being here. It's been really fun talking with you.
Thank you. It has been an honor and a pleasure.
Every episode here at That Shakespeare Life has what's called our show notes. It's an accompanying website that goes along with the podcast audio that shares with you direct links to the work of our guest and the recommendations that they provide for you. This week, you can find links to Robert's work along with all the resources he suggests you start with if you'd like to learn more about 16th century transportation. You can find this at CassidyCash.com/episode 364. While you're on the website, if you'd like to go more in depth with the history we're talking about today to see primary documents, woodcuts, paintings, and other tidbits about historical transportation, then you can click the detailed show notes button. This expands for patrons of our show, and you can log in using your Patreon credentials or join if you're not already a supporter of our show. And a whole bunch of detailed extras will expand right there below the audio that you're listening to so that you can explore the history visually while you're listening to the show. You can find all of these extras at CassidyCash.com/episode 364. That's CassidyCash.com/EP364. If you are really into Shakespeare history and you want to go beyond the episode to really try out the history that you hear about here on the show, then be sure to check out our DIY history activity kits on That Shakespeare Shop. Each kit lets you explore a game, recipe, or craft straight from the life of William Shakespeare that you can complete at home or in your classroom. Find out more and get your first kit today at CassidyCash.com/ThatShakespeareShop. Patrons of the show, remember to use your discount code to get 20% off every kit we sell in the shop. That Shakespeare Life is researched and produced by me, Cassidy Cash. Our audio engineer is Gary Mayholm. That's it for this week. Thank you for listening. I'm Cassidy Cash, and I hope you learned something new about the Bard. I'll see you next time. Bye-bye.
Thank you for listening to That Shakespeare Life. As always, the best conversations happen after the episode over at CassidyCash.com. Become a part of a vibrant Shakespeare conversation by adding your voice over at the website. Until next time, remember, when you want to know William Shakespeare, you have to go behind the curtain and into That Shakespeare Life.